along this evening. It's great to see so many of you here and some new faces, some slightly older faces. So hi and welcome. For those of you that are new to Café Scientifique here at Boscanova, here's a little bit about how this evening's going to work. We're going to have our particularly special guest speaker. He's going to talk for around about between half an hour and 45 minutes. Although I know we have Bryce back here in the audience, who I think held the record for the longest talk. So we'll see how that goes. We'll then have a short break to grab ourselves some drink and pop to loo, that sort of thing. And then we'll reconvene to sort of open up the floor for discussion. But if actually we're asking lots of questions as we go along, then we'll do it that way and kind of move on. Please do make yourselves at home and do grab drinks or bites to eat as we go through the evening. It's fantastic that these guys actually open up for us of an evening, so we really appreciate you supporting them in doing so. For those of you that haven't been before, obviously the fire exit's just behind you, the loos are downstairs. Welcome on behalf of all of the Café Scientifique team. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Rebecca Edwards. I'm based at Bournemouth University supporting public engagement and impact activities. We also have Emily Dimnett here from AECC. To the front, she's very shy, you have to be nice to her. And also welcome our new colleague, Emily Loring, who's just joined my department and will be supporting public engagement activities over the next year. Now, is anyone lucky enough to be going to Festival this weekend? Hey! Well, please make sure you check out the science tent at Festival, because the other half of the sort of Café Scientifique team have actually got taking over a corner of the science tent to do some public engagement with a much, much bigger public. So I'm sure they're having lots of fun. Apparently they have to go there tonight to set up. Sounds like lots of setting up to me. Or maybe just cider drinking. Just to kind of a note, as ever, we'd like to take some pictures as we're going along. And tonight, you have noticed we actually have a far more professional looking filming outfit, and that's because these guys they're actually helping out with some marketing by doing a bit of filming of the evening. Now, if anybody doesn't want to be filmed or appear on any promotional materials or anything like that, please do let us know, or the guys that are filming, do you want to give a wave? Embarrassing. So just let us know and we'll make sure that kind of doesn't happen. So I think that's everything housekeeping wise. Looking to my colleagues. Now it gives me enormous pleasure to welcome Professor Richard Holt from the University of Southampton this evening, which is looking forward to a really fascinating talk. He's a professor of diabetes and endocrinology with really, really extensive research interests. I won't go through them all now because we will take up all the time available as for talk, but it's around diabetes and endocrinology, including the relationship in terms with mental health, development of the adult disease, and the benefits of physical activity. And just the sheer volume of research can be indicated by the some £3 million of research funds that he's been funded to do that work with. He's also got a number of clinical responsibilities, including as an honorary consultant at Southampton, and also Chair of Council of Healthcare Professionals of Diabetes UK. So I think we're enormously lucky to have this kind of talk today. I will let Richard introduce the topic of it. But before we begin, can we say a big Café Scientifique welcome to Richard?
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for that very warm introduction and welcome to be here. It's the first time I've been to a Café Scientifique and I'm really pleased to be here. As you've heard, I'm very happy to take questions or comments as we go through the talk, and in fact if I don't get in, I think I'll probably send you to sleep. So heckling is fine. Please do feel free to butt in and ask at any point. So the topic of conversation tonight is one of performance-enhancing drugs in sports, or more commonly known as doping. So this man's been in the news again this week. Ben Johnson, 1988, he became the fastest man in the world when he won the 100 metres at the Seoul Olympic Games. Unfortunately, his triumph didn't last very long, because very shortly after that he was disqualified for having taken anabolic steroids. So what I would like to do over the evening is really to cover a number of areas. The first is to just think about doping and why athletes dope, some of the history of that, and also think a little bit about the history of the anti-doping movement. And then actually to think about some of the more sexy drugs that the athletes take, particularly thinking about anabolic steroids, thinking about growth hormone, which is my own particular area of interest, thinking about erythropoietin, and perhaps also share some of the anecdotes that come from from listening to some of the athletes who've taken these drugs. And then finally just talk a little bit about therapeutic use exemption, which allows people, so for example, people with diabetes, to be able to take drugs which would otherwise be banned. So without any further ado, let's start off with the history of doping. So does anybody like to think about or like to suggest when doping was first recorded? And clearly it's been in the news a lot over the last number of years. Would anybody actually like to suggest when doping was first thought about?
Back in Greek and Roman times.
Back in Greek and Roman times, absolutely. Did you see my slide before I started? Clearly did. So actually some of the earliest records of doping in sport go back to the ancient Greeks. Charmis, who was one of the original Olympic runners, was said to have won following taken a number of figs. Exactly why the figs might have been of benefit, I don't know whether it was a laxative effect, had to get to the end of the race quickly, but nevertheless that's some of the earliest reports. But what I'd like to think about is fast forwarding now is when there was the birth of modern drug development, and to think about the sorts of drugs that have been used by elite athletes since around the 19th century. And we actually have really good records of what people used to take in the 19th century, because it was completely unregulated, and in fact it was thought to be a good thing. You know, could we push the human body yet further and further? And some of the sportsmen around that time used to do some absolutely crazy things. So for example, there was a cycle race that used to go on for 3 days, and the idea was to see how far you could cycle in 3 days, and the winner was the person who had gone the farthest distance. And of course, well, you know, I don't know about you, but I feel pretty knackered if I'm staying up after about midnight. So these guys having to stay up 3 days on the trot and needing things in order to keep them going. And there were a number of different published regimens that they had to take in order to get the best of the performance. So the sorts of things that they might take. Caffeine, yes, it is performance enhancing, and it's one of the few legal performance enhancing drugs. Other things that perhaps not quite so healthy, things like strychnine, things like belladonna, so from deadly nightshade, and morphine. But there were very good records about what the sorts of drugs that people used. I wasn't to say that they were safe, and indeed probably one of the earliest recorded performance-enhancing related deaths was in fact of Arthur Linson, who was a cyclist who was said to have died in 1886, having taken a compound known as trimethyl. It's also actually suggested that in fact he didn't die, and this was a complete myth, but that's another story. Now, my particular specialty is endocrinology, so thinking about hormones and their effects, and of course the effects of hormones are recognised and have been recognised all the way back to biblical times, when it was recognised that testosterone had effects on performance, predominantly through the manipulations of cattle, but also there are records in ancient history of people eating testicles or of either animals or indeed some of their vanquished enemies in the past as a means of performing their benefits. But really modern endocrinology started in the 19th century with the work of this gentleman here, Charles Brown Sicard. And what he did was to do a number of experiments where he injected himself first with blood that had come from the testicular veins of either a dog or a guinea pig. He then actually used semen and injected himself with that. He also mashed up some testes and injected that into him. I'm sure you would not get ethical permission to do these sorts of experiments today, but nevertheless he did so. And what he described was this remarkable improvement in his physical and mental agility and energy. And he presented this to the Society for Medicine in Paris. And he also described that once he'd actually stopped taking these, this effect really diminished very rapidly to his previous elderly self. And it's probably thought that now that a lot of what he was describing was almost certainly a placebo effect, and that the likelihood of this causing him any benefit is actually pretty close to zero. But nevertheless, the genie was out of the bottle, if you like, and so this whole thought about using hormones as a means of actually enhancing performance really came into being at that time. So when was it becoming systematic? Well, probably the first systematic use of testosterone in humans was probably around the time of the 1936 Olympic Games, when the German team are rumoured to have having taken significant amounts of testosterone in order to boost their performance at the Games. The first case, which was more properly documented, was in fact not in humans, but it was in fact in a horse named Holloway, who was really coming to the end of his racing career, but was given testosterone in the 1940s and suddenly actually started to win his races again, and in fact established a trotting record once he'd reached the age of 19. So let's just take a step aside from some of that history and thinking about some of the actual agents, but just to ask the question about why do athletes actually dope in the first place? So why do you think they dope?
To win.
They want to win, don't they? You know, it's estimated that if you're an Olympic gold medalist, you will earn at least £1 million. So clearly there is a big financial incentive, and also there is that psychological boost that you get from winning as well. But I'd also perhaps suggest to you that the other reason why athletes dope is because they can get away with it. Because if they couldn't get away with it, then they wouldn't do it. Now let me just illustrate why I think this is the case, and just give you the results of a study that was undertaken back in 1995, so a little while ago now, of 198 elite American athletes. And they were said you're offered a performance enhancing drug with two guarantees. Firstly, you're not going to get caught, and secondly, you're going to win. So, what proportion of athletes said, with these two guarantees, that they would take a drug?
194, the other 40 answer the question.
Okay, so you've got 194. Any other thoughts? Do you all think 194?
Yeah.
Less, more?
I'd like to think less.
You'd like to think less. Okay, what proportion do you think of these guys are honest then?
50-50.
So you think it's about 50%?
All of them.
Okay. 195, so not far off. I think the prize goes to the gentleman in the corner. But the other interesting thing was that they then asked a supplementary question, and they said, would you take a performance enhancing drug with the same two guarantees? You're not going to get caught, you're going to win for the next 5 years, but then after 10 years, you will die as a result of taking this performance enhancing drug. So what percentage do you think would still take it under these circumstances?
All of them.
Same.
Yeah, the same.
So 100% death rate after 10 years, well actually it's not quite that, but it's about 50%. Still said that they would take it, despite the fact that they would die as a result of taking it. And I think that helps to think about some of the psychology that athletes actually have when they have these very short-term goals in terms of winning the sporting events that they're involved in. Okay, so what about anti-doping? What about the anti-doping movement? And really there's a number of rationales around the regulation about anti-doping. The first is safeguarding the health of the athletes, and I think that previous study actually illustrates why there needs to be regulation to prevent harm coming from the athletes, because it would suggest that they don't necessarily in the right position to make informed consent. So the first thing is to try to prevent psychological harm. The second thing is that if you are on that Olympic start line with your 8 competitors and you think that every other of those competitors has been taking a performance enhancing drug, then what's the pressure on you to do that? Because you think, well, if they're all taking it, clearly it's doing them some benefit, and I need to take it as well in order to do that. And just as a by the by, I showed you Ben Johnson. Subsequently, 6 of the other 7 athletes who were on the start line with him were then found guilty of a doping offence at some point subsequently during their career. So there has to be a means of trying to discouraging people.
Wouldn't doping be safer if it was legal?
Well, there is a question. I'll come back and answer that question. And then the other thing is about whether doping is actually causing an unfair advantage. So these are the principles, but as has been alluded to, there is a question about whether this is a genuine, or whether one can pick holes in the arguments about that. Because there is obviously the thought that if you actually provide people with safe drugs, that perhaps that would be better than allowing an unregulated complete prohibition on the grounds that it's been very difficult to stop people. The other thing about, drugs causing an unfair advantage or not, well, is it fair that people have the funding to go to high altitude training in North Africa? Or is it fair that people have access to training facilities that other people don't? And just to sort of give you a little bit of another example of inconsistency, it's okay to go to high altitude training camps, but it's not okay to use hypobaric chambers, which do effectively very similar things. There's also issues about psychological harm and physical harm, and I can certainly tell you there are more people who have died as a result of being in a rugby scrum than have died as a result of taking drugs. And yet we let rugby players go into scrums, we let people hurtle down mountains at 100 miles an hour. So there is again a little bit of an inconsistency. But nevertheless, I do think that there is a reason. These reasons do mean that I think that anti-doping regulation is appropriate. So when did anti-doping regulation really start to kick in? Well, it was after a fatality at the 1960 Olympic Games where Knut Jensen, a cyclist, died following possibly taking amphetamines. And as a result of that, there was the feeling that there was a need to start to develop anti-doping regulation, and the International Olympic Medical Commission was then set up to try to regulate that. And it was created in 1961 under the chairmanship of Princeton Road, who actually set up this special subcommission to think about doping and biochemistry in sport. And he enlisted Manfred Donnecker, who was a biochemist working in Cologne, to try to start to develop methodologies to detect athletes taking drugs, but also to provide education to try to prevent that from happening. The Medical Commission was then disbanded in 2002 when an independent World Anti-Doping Agency was then set up, and a lot of sports now subscribe to the World Anti-Doping Agency Code. So what counts as doping? Well, I guess some of this is obvious. If somebody is taking a drug and they're found to having been taking a drug, that counts as doping. But there are also other regulations that fall under the anti-doping code. So for example, if an athlete refuses to provide a sample, that counts. If you remember, Rio Ferdinand was banned for a doping offence because he wasn't available to have the test. It wasn't that he was found to had taken the test. There are also issues about possession, so you can't say, well, it's just in my case, it's not in me. There are also regulations about team doctors and physios and other members of the team as well, so it isn't just the athlete. And every year the World Anti-Doping Agency publishes a list of different drugs that it says that can't be used. Some of them can never be used at any time. Some of them can only some of them are banned only in certain sports. So for example, beta blockers, which are often used to treat high blood pressure, slow the heart rate and therefore can slow tremor, are banned in specific sports like archery and snooker, but not necessarily throughout. And there are also some that are banned only at the time of competition, but people can use it at other times. So for example, alcohol is banned during horse racing, and I guess you wouldn't necessarily want to have a pissed jockey on a horse ride. So there's a question about no, I didn't mean the jockey rather.
Just on that, would it be sort of difficult to detect if someone had framed an athlete by spiking their drink or something before?
There is a situation of the athlete is responsible for whatever is in their body, and it's no good saying somebody gave me this. So there have been a number of excuses in the past where athletes have said, I didn't give it, my drink was spiked by the CIA. In the case of a Cuban athlete, I was taking my wife's painkillers or whatever. It's entirely up to the athlete to be responsible for what they eat. So it doesn't matter how it got there. If it's there, it's their fault. And I don't know if you remember, there was a case of a British Winter Olympian who won a gold medal but was then subsequently disqualified for a doping offence. And what had happened is that he'd been taking a cold remedy that was available in the UK, and when he got out to Canada he bought what he thought was the same cold remedy, but the composition was different in Canada compared with what it was in the UK, and he'd completely done it by mistake. You know, he just thought, well, this is the same thing, and my medical team had okayed this in the UK but hadn't okayed it in Canada. And although there was sympathy for what he had done, and there's no question that he had done it deliberately, he was still found guilty and disqualified, because effectively he could still have had a performance benefit for.
That was Alan Baxter, wasn't it? I think.
Yeah.
It was Vix.
Yeah, it was Vix.
Yeah.
Okay, so what I'd like to do specifically is to talk about three hormonal drugs that are used. I think a little bit about anabolic steroids, also growth hormone, which is my particular area of interest, and then also erythropoietin. Let's just start off with anabolic steroids. So this is the one biochemistry slide. Well, no, it's not quite the only. It's one of two biochemistry slides. So this is the basic molecular structure of cholesterol, which is the basis of many of the hormones and the basis of anabolic and androgenic steroids. So if we think about testosterone, which is the archetypal anabolic steroid, testosterone has two effects. It has an anabolic effect, and what we mean by that is muscle bulking up. And the other is androgenic, which is making the man who has that testosterone become more masculine. So, for example, one of the effects of testosterone is called beard growth, but it's also the hormone that's responsible for the change in shape that boys have when they become men. And there's been a number of changes that can be manipulated to the basic structure of testosterone to try to manipulate the relationship between the anabolic effect and the androgenic effect. And what the athlete is really after is the anabolic effect. They want that muscle bulking effect. There can also be changes that allow the anabolic steroids to be given either orally or whether they need to be given by injection. And that has more relevance, not so much in terms of its performance effects, but more in terms of the side effect profile that we can see from anabolic steroids. Now, if we actually go back to the 1970s, there was a huge debate about whether taking anabolic steroids did the athlete any benefit at all. And there were sort of papers that were written like this saying there is no evidence that anabolic steroids have any effect on athletes. Athletes are deluding themselves about taking these drugs, and there's really no suggestion that this is going to have a benefit. Now, of course, the athletes thought, you're crazy. We know that these are having effects on us, and we're going to continue to take them. And this is the first example that I'll give where athletes are actually better scientists than the scientists. Because, of course, subsequently, there has been evidence that anabolic steroids work. And at the very same time that these papers were being written by the Western literature, if we went behind the Iron Curtain, there were PhDs being done, both in Russia and in East Germany, showing quite clearly that anabolic steroids have a performance benefit. Now, this comes from one of those PhDs that was undertaken in former East Germany, and what it shows is what a female shot putter was able to throw after 2.5 months worth of anabolic steroids. Now, I don't know about you, but I would say that going from a distance of about 17.5 metres up to about 19.5 metres is actually quite a significant improvement for that particular athlete. Yeah? And we can see the long-term effect of what happened about those East German athletes. Now, like looking around the room, I think there's probably not too many people with enough grey hairs to actually remember watching the Olympics in the 1970s. But you know, you'd look at some of these East German and Russian athletes and think, female athletes, and think, you are not a woman, you are a man, you just look like a man. And the reason why is because they were taking all, yeah, as I can see a couple of nods going around in the audience, saying, well, you know, this is what they look like. And you can see what happens to the performance and the winning medal distance during this period of time when anabolic steroids were pretty much readily available and used. And you can see that the distance goes up. The IOC bans it. Of course, just banning it doesn't make any difference if you can't actually detect somebody taking it. And it's only when you start to test people that you actually start to have an effect on the use. And you can see that following the introduction of testing, and particularly out of competition testing, that the winning distance actually has started to fall. I should have updated it, putting on the latest distance from 2012, but I can tell you that none of the women in the 2012 final would have made the final in 1980. And that just is a testament of the potency of these anabolic steroids. And I use the example of women more than men because men obviously have quite significant amounts of testosterone already, and to add a little bit more probably has slightly lesser effect than to women where the levels are endogenously much lower and you're then increasing it. But it isn't just elite athletes that are using anabolic steroids, it's being used across the population. And in fact, if you look at about the use of anabolic steroids across the whole population, probably only about 20% of users are using it for competition. The others are using it because they want to improve their physical appearance. And probably the commonest group of people are young, middle-aged heterosexual men. That's not to say that other groups are not using it. And you can see that overall there's quite a sizable proportion of the population either regularly use it or have used it at some point during their lives. So why do I think that this is not a good idea? We've talked a little bit already about the effects of anabolic steroids not being not only the effects on muscle growth, but also their effects on masculinization. And that's most prominently seen among women rather than men. And this is one particular case that I would just like to highlight. Now, Heidi Krieger was the East German European shot put champion back in 1986. And she subsequently wrote a book, They Killed Heidi, which discusses a lot of the way in which the former East German sporting regime used to systematically dope female athletes. And the reason why she entitled her book They Killed Heidi was because in fact the photograph on the right, if you hadn't realised, is in fact Heidi Krieger, who is now living as Andreas Krieger following her sex change as a result of the long-term virilizing effects of the testosterone. But it isn't just that effect, and it's not, you might say, well, if that was the only effect, well, surely it's fine for men, and the answer is no, it isn't. We know that anabolic steroids, particularly anabolic steroids that are taken by mouth, have significant effects on liver function, so they can cause jaundice, they can actually kill off the liver cells, they can cause fatty deposits within the liver, they can cause this particular condition called pileosis hepaticus, where the person develops cysts within the liver which then bleed, and it also increases the risk of liver cancer. So you think, why would anybody actually want to start taking this? Oh, and if that's not enough, it gives you heart disease as well. So it changes the shape of the heart, it affects the way the heart works, leads to structural changes within the heart, and it causes cholesterol abnormalities. So that's two very important organs that are also being affected by this drug. And of course there are psychiatric problems, and if any of you have got teenage boys, you'll understand some of the effects of testosterone, and of course in larger amounts then that also has quite significant adverse effects. So how do we actually detect anabolic steroid use? Well, what we know is that a lot of these anabolic steroids are steroids that should not be present in the body. So if they are there, the only way they could have got there is by somebody having taken them. And the way that you can detect these steroids is by doing mass spectrometry of the urine samples that are taken from individual athletes. How common is the use of anabolic steroids? Well, of course, we don't actually know the answer to that, because most athletes are not going to be saying, yes, sure, I did it. A very conservative estimate would be the 1% that are found positive in terms of testing by the anti-doping laboratories, but the likelihood is that the numbers that have taken it within sports are obviously much higher than that. Okay, so an overview of anabolic steroids. I'm very happy if anybody has any questions they'd like to ask about anabolic steroids before I go on to growth hormone.
Thinking about them.
Thinking about them. Store them all up. Okay. Well, let's move on to growth hormone, which, as I say, is my particular area of interest. Now, here's another.
Terribly sorry. Can I just ask, if you do take steroids,
Yeah.
does that have an effect on your muscle growth?
Yeah.
How long does that last for, and how long do you detect it?
In terms of detection, it's certainly a number of weeks that you can, and it also slightly depends on which anabolic steroid you have. In terms of the effects on performance, there are probably some long-term effects on it, but also probably depends on when you take it. So for example, if you take it during a time of adolescence as you're growing,
Yeah.
it will have greater effects than if you take it at another time. So yes, you can still have some long-term benefits, performance enhancements, I should say, which is part of the reason why I think there is a justification for actually saying, if you've been caught taking these, actually a 2-year ban isn't enough. It probably do need to be longer than that.
But it starts off with someone who's young with anabolic steroids to produce a generation of people who wouldn't be detected, to detect the steroids, but they've had the benefits of that during their growth.
Yeah, I mean, that is a concern. I mean, I think if you start it too early, you will actually stunt the growth.
Yeah,
But assuming that you started at the right time, maybe you started at the age of 17 and continue till 23, and then people start competing later than that. Yeah, I mean, there is an argument for that, but from a performance enhancement effect, but of course there are still the adverse effects that those individuals might encounter. And I certainly wouldn't be advocating.
I don't want to monopolise the whole thing, but because this comes down to an argument almost between sort of fame and longevity, isn't it? What are people actually willing to do? You have the statistics about how many people would be willing to take the drug even though it would kill them in 10 years.
Yes.
Is that their choice? But, you know, they have an objectively better life if they were famous for 10 years and then died, a hero, or if they live to 80 but not there.
Okay, what about the person? Well, I mean, of course, none of those are guarantees, are
No,
they?
no,
So
no,
you still can't
no.
say whether somebody's going to be
No. And if everyone was doing it, you couldn't guarantee winning.
Correct. So I mean, that's one of the arguments why you'd say, well, that's spurious to say, you know, if everybody's taking it, you're all going to be on the same playing field.
And if everyone was taking it, it would load it more towards the pressure on other people to do it as well. But
Correct.
is that not people's choice?
Well, is it? Do you think it is?
I don't know. It'd be interesting to see 8-foot tall human fortresses battering into each other, wouldn't it? Okay, I'm playing.
No. I mean, you do make a very, very important point that, you know, why do we ban it? I mean, I've already illustrated that there is this issue about psychological, about harm, and people are more likely to come to harm through rugby scrums or skiing than from taking drugs in sport. So I guess there is a question about what is sport.
That's it, isn't it? I mean, I'm doing quite a lot of damage to my liver with red wine today. But the whole thing is, it's my choice to do it. The fact that you're imposing limits on what you can and can't do in terms of performance-enhancing drugs, it's almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy. You're having the problems that you're having with people having liver problems, heart problems, and whatever, are to an extent there because no one can legitimately do a lot of research on what it would, if you could create these anabolic versus androgenic steroids to take out the androgenic effects, would the anabolic steroids then just make you better? And there wouldn't be any negative effects. Or could you potentially come up with a drug that just enhanced performance but didn't have any negative side effects? And if you could, well, it comes down to almost a question of morality at the end of the day.
Or it's called gene doping, which is your next best bet.
Yeah, absolutely. You then wind up with potentially somebody who can naturally generate. You're talking about growth hormone as well, and some people generate more. Growth hormone is something we all generate.
Yes.
Like,
Yeah.
some people generate more than others.
Yeah, that's true.
And if you want a level playing field, shouldn't the people who generate less be allowed to pop up?
I mean, you're not saying anything that I haven't heard before, and I think in the end it does come down to what do you I'm using a collective view. What does society think sport is? What are the ideals of sport? You know, why is it that we watch sport in the first place? Now, clearly things have changed in terms of the way people view sport. So, for example, as I mentioned already, if we go back to the 19th century when they had those endurance cycling races, the thoughts there was, you know, it was absolutely fine to take performance-enhancing drugs in order to see how far people would go. Now, at the moment, the prevailing view is that actually taking drugs is cheating. No, I mean, that's the prevailing view. Now, I guess, show of hands, who thinks that doping is cheating? So, okay, who doesn't think doping is cheating?
Depends on the sport. It depends on the philosophy of the sport. I mean, the argument is, I take a more pragmatic view. If you allow doping, you have to look at the sport as a whole, from grassroots right up to elite level. If you legalise it, the guys that get the appropriate support, GB, full-time athletes, will have doctors and have physios that will be regulated. You're poorer nations won't. So you'll have athletes that are using the same drugs inappropriately, but also you'll have amateur athletes ordering it off the internet who have no idea and no expertise and no support for using either, and they'll be dying as a result. And that's the problem that you have. You have to look at the sport from bottom right up to top.
Why not just have two versions of every sport? One which is pure and the other one where you can do what the hell you like?
Well, it's interesting you should. It's interesting you should.
Yes.
It's very interesting you should say that. So, you know, another area where anabolic steroids are used a lot is in sort of the Mr. Universe type competitions, those bodybuilding competitions. And they did, at one point, have two separate competitions. So they had the enhanced body and the I've done it naturally body competition. So, of course, what happened was that those who'd been taking the drugs thought, still not winning this one. But if I put myself into the other one, I would win. And that's what they did. So in the end, they despite having the legal competition, they had probably as many people taking drugs in the non-permitted competition. And so it almost made a mockery of that. And I think that's what you would find, is that you would still get to that point where people still want to win, and if they think, well, I can't win if I admit to taking drugs, I'll try and win by not admitting to taking them.
Is there a crossover? I mean, you've got special Olympics where Oscar Pistorius, before his fourth race, decision pending, was, I mean, it seemed to me, you know, I know nothing about it, but one of the reasons that we won't keep it to actually run the Olympics is that they because of the blades and the fact that they gave you certain capital advantages.
Yeah, and absolutely, there was a lot of question about whether blades gave people a mechanical advantage, and there was a lot of discussion about that. Again, there's a question. These aren't obviously they're not scientific questions; they're philosophical questions. But I mean, I agree. I absolutely agree with you.
Is there a scientific basis for the morality of it? Can you?
How can you have a scientific basis for philosophy?
Well, because if you could, for instance, have a drug that was safe, that wasn't going to have anything, hypothetically, a lot of the arguments for not taking it are removed, because the competition element, if everyone has got access to it, if it does enhance performance, it's not going to shorten your lifespan or destroy your liver or your heart or anything, then
Is that a problem? Yeah, but
should we all have it?
you're then making everybody the same anyway, so why take a drug to begin with?
We don't start off the same.
But that's the whole point, isn't it? Everybody's different, everybody's good at something.
Sports is all about elitism, basically. I mean, it's not fair that like someone with no legs isn't going to win the 100-meter sprint at the Olympics. But I mean, you can't then build them robot legs.
We're talking physical aspects here. I mean, there are mental aspects as well. There are drugs which change your mental performance. I mean, you know, is it fair that your lawyer in a court case, you know, takes mental performance enhancing drugs? You know, isn't that to an extent more of a problem? If you've got,
You've already got it with caffeine to a certain extent. That's a stimulant.
Yeah.
That's legal.
so
I think that's. We're opening up lots of really interesting areas of debate, which I think we're going to come back to, but I'm quite excited to learn a bit more about the use of growth hormone.
Unless you want to have a break. Quarter past 8.
Yeah. In which case, what I suggest we do, as we're all kind of getting our grey matter going, is just take a kind of 10-minute break now to recharge our glasses and see if you empty glasses here, and then we'll come back to the rest of the presentation and talk afterwards. Thank you.